They say HOAs can get petty, controlling, power-hungry. But nothing prepares you for the moment you walk outside and find half your house swallowed by the earth, while the HOA president stands in the street pretending to cry for the cameras. Emergency lights washed over the neighborhood in red and blue, flickering across stucco walls and winter-dormant lawns. The quiet cul-de-sac looked like a disaster zone. Police cruisers boxed in the street, city inspectors taped off the yard, and a structural response team rushed around photographing everything as if they'd just uncovered a crime scene, because they had. In the middle of it all stood Keith Wood, still covered in concrete dust. His shirt streaked in gray. His hands trembling as he clutched a stack of engineering reports and the footage he'd captured hours earlier, footage that would blow this entire place apart. Behind him, where his basement once held old storage tubs and holiday decorations, a gaping void pulsed with the faint hum of generators. A sinkhole-like rupture opened beneath the foundation, revealing the truth the HOA had tried so desperately to hide. Support beams wedged into the soil. Cables stretching across a carved-out chamber nearly as large as a garage. Fresh tool marks etched into the dirt. A tunnel, an actual hidden tunnel, leading straight toward the HOA president's property line. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, phones out, whispering with the same mixture of horror and the quiet admission that, honestly, they weren't surprised. Because this wasn't the first time HOA President Delilah Gray went after Keith. But it was definitely the first time she tried to do it from underground. And there she was, center stage, sobbing so loudly the officers had to keep telling her to step back. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, hair frizzed out, hands flailing like she was the victim of a natural disaster instead of the architect of it. "This is his fault," she screamed at no one in particular, pointing at Keith like she expected a crowd to rise up and agree with her. "He destabilized his own house. He caused this. I warned him this would happen." No one listened. Not the officers. Not the inspectors. Not the neighbors who'd seen months of strange trucks idling near Delilah's garage. And definitely not Keith, who just stared at the exposed tunnel entrance in cold, exhausted silence. The ground didn't lie. The earth itself had spit out the truth. Delilah's performance kept spiraling, hand gestures, dramatic sobbing, stepping into camera shots. But the more she acted, the more obvious the real story became. Because every official on scene kept returning to the same questions. Why were there fresh support beams installed beneath Keith's home? Why were generators, tools, and construction materials hidden underground? And how on earth did an HOA think they could get away with digging a tunnel directly under a homeowner's foundation? But Keith already knew the answer. He'd been feeling the vibrations in the basement for weeks, those faint morning tremors that didn't match passing trucks or water lines. He'd noted the new cracks creeping across the walls, the sharp chemical odor that drifted through the vents some nights. And every time he brought it up to the HOA, they brushed him off. Or worse, they blamed him. And something else hung over the street that night, unspoken but unmistakable. A tension Keith had lived with since the day he moved in. The comments. The random rule violations. The attempts to fine him for things no one else was fined for. The quiet pattern of who Delilah chose to target and who she didn't. This tunnel wasn't random. This collapse wasn't an accident. This was a plan. A removal. A land grab dressed up as an expansion project that never existed on paper because the permits were forged. And as the flashing lights reflected off the widening crater beneath his home, Keith felt the weight of it all settle on him. They hadn't just tried to sabotage his property. They tried to bury him. Literally. So here's the question, the one Keith keeps asking himself even now. What would you do if your own HOA dug a hidden tunnel under your house, just to force you off your land? Long before the sinkhole ripped open the truth, before emergency lights flooded the cul-de-sac and exposed the tunnel hidden under his foundation, Keith Wood lived what he thought was a simple, steady life. Not perfect, not glamorous, but his. Hardened. Built brick by brick from the quiet pride that came from knowing he'd carved out a home that honored where he came from. Keith grew up in a family that treated land as more than dirt. His grandparents had once owned a small plot outside Savannah, a patch of earth they tended with devotion. They raised vegetables, hosted summer cookouts, and kept a pecan tree alive for 4 generations. When they passed, Keith built a small memorial corner in his home, framed photos, handwritten recipes, and a jar of soil brought from that old property. That corner wasn't fancy, but it grounded him. It reminded him that he came from people who fought to keep what little they had, even when the world made it hard. So when Keith finally bought his home in Burquillo Estates, a quiet-looking suburban development with pristine sidewalks and perfectly trimmed hedges, he felt like he'd finally given his grandparents' legacy something solid to stand on. The house wasn't new. It was built in the late 80s, a bit worn, with scuffed hardwood and a yard desperate for attention. But Keith saw potential everywhere. He spent evenings patching the fence, early weekend mornings cleaning out overgrown shrubs, and long afternoons replacing outdated fixtures with pieces he refinished himself. Over a year, the place transformed. The backyard turned into his sanctuary, string lights along the fence, a stone pathway he laid by hand, raised garden beds filled with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. The basement became his workshop for restoring old furniture. Every improvement, no matter how small, stitched him deeper into the home. This wasn't just property. This was legacy. And maybe that was the real problem. Because in Burquillo Estates, owning your home wasn't the same as controlling it. The HOA carried itself like the neighborhood's moral compass, polished newsletters, strict community standards, smiling board members who acted like they ran a private country club. They called it maintaining neighborhood prestige, but Keith learned quickly that prestige had a narrow definition here. It was the kind of place where people talked about diversity during block parties but side-eyed anyone who didn't look like they belonged on the brochure. Where neighbors smiled with their mouths and judged with their eyes. Where the phrase property values floated through conversations like incense, pleasant on the surface, suffocating beneath it. And at the top of this carefully maintained hierarchy stood Delilah Gray, the HOA president who managed to make perfection look like a threat. Immaculately dressed. Blonde bob razor straight. Clipboard seemingly fused to her hand. The type of person who said, "Good morning," like a warning. Delilah didn't lead the HOA, she commanded it. Rules bent for her. Fines appeared for everyone else. She was known for her passive-aggressive newsletters filled with lines like, "Some homeowners may not realize their lawn colors clash with the neighborhood palette." Certain residents appear unaware of storage limitations visible from public sidewalks. Everyone knew who the some homeowners were. Everyone knew who filed the anonymous complaints. Everyone knew which houses she drove past especially slow. So when Keith received his first violation, he wasn't surprised. Decorative lighting installed without prior approval. Does crime? String lights in the backyard. Not visible from the street. Not visible to anyone except the family of raccoons that occasionally stole tomatoes from his garden. He removed the lights anyway. It wasn't worth the fight. But the tension didn't fade. If anything, it simmered under the polished surface of the neighborhood, a quiet, constant pressure building from moments too subtle to name but too pointed to ignore. The way Delilah watched him whenever he mowed the lawn. The way she inserted herself into casual conversations with neighbors when he walked by. The way she inspected his property with exaggerated thoroughness, each footstep slow, deliberate, as if she were waiting to catch him doing something wrong. Keith told himself he was imagining it. He had work to focus on, a home to keep improving, a life to keep moving forward. He wasn't about to let an HOA president ruin the peace he'd built. For a while, he succeeded. His routine stayed steady, long mornings making coffee in the quiet kitchen, afternoons tending the garden, evenings sanding down furniture pieces to restore. He hosted small backyard dinners for cousins who visited. He planted a young pecan tree to honor his family history, the beginning of what he hoped would grow for decades. But then came the first odd vibration in the basement. It was faint, like a low hum, barely noticeable. Keith dismissed it as old plumbing or the natural shifting of the soil. The house was older after all. Cracks appeared in homes all the time. Settling was normal. But a week later, a jar slid off a basement shelf. Then a screwdriver rolled across the workbench. A paint can toppled with no obvious reason. He shrugged it off. He had projects upstairs to finish. A summer storm had rolled through recently, maybe that had shifted the foundation. He planned to call a plumber or get a soil inspection, normal homeowner stuff. Then Delilah called an emergency HOA meeting. It was announced through one of her signature overly polished emails, subject line, structural integrity concerns in the community. For most residents, it was easy to ignore. Their homes were fine. But Delilah phrased it in a way that didn't feel like a suggestion, more like an accusation wrapped in concern. During the meeting, she clicked through slides about potential risks to neighborhood stability, soil quality, drainage lines, vibration-related issues. But every example, every diagram, every pointed glance drifted toward Keith. Subtle enough to deny, obvious enough for the message to land. She wrapped the meeting by saying, certain properties may need more oversight. We can't have the reputation of Burquillo compromised. And then she said it, the line Keith would come to understand as the spark that lit everything that followed. I'll handle it. No one asked what that meant. No one challenged her. The room nodded along, as if her word alone carried authority. Keith didn't realize then that this moment was the turning point, the quiet shift from irritation to danger. He didn't know that Delilah wasn't just watching him. She was planning something. Because behind the manicured lawns and cheerful newsletters, behind the community spirit and property values, the real truth was beginning to take shape beneath his feet. Literally. And the basement vibrations that Keith wrote off as plumbing? They were the first whispers of the tunnel he didn't yet know existed, the tunnel Delilah had already begun digging. The neighborhood still seemed peaceful on the surface. But something underneath was already moving, already shifting, already breaking. Keith just hadn't learned to listen to the ground yet. The first real shift happened on a Wednesday morning, subtle enough to overlook, powerful enough to mark the beginning of everything that followed. Keith woke to a faint rumble under the hardwood, the kind of vibration that made coffee ripple in his mug like breath against still water. At first, he blamed nearby construction. But the vibrations came again the next day, and then again the next. Always in the early morning. Always just long enough to make him freeze. Then the cracks started appearing. A thin line across the basement wall. Another by the stairs. A third one behind the washer, jagged and curling like a branch on a winter tree. Keith tried to reason with himself. Old house, shifting soil, maybe normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. He started documenting everything. He took photos, dated notes, even video clips when the vibrations came strong enough to shake the workbench. He didn't know what he was preparing for, but instinct told him trouble was coming. And it arrived faster than he expected. The first HOA inspection came 3 days later. Unannounced. 2 board members he barely knew walked his property with clipboards, murmuring to each other while pretending not to stare at the hairline cracks near the foundation. They didn't ask permission. They didn't offer explanation. They simply walked, scribbled notes, and left a notice taped to his door. Fence height exceeds allowed variance. It didn't. Keith had measured it himself when he moved in. But the notice came with a threat, fix it or pay a daily fine. The second inspection arrived 2 days later, this time early in the morning. This time, Delilah was with him. She didn't smile. She didn't greet him. She didn't even acknowledge him beyond a cold, satisfied sweep of her eyes across his property. That afternoon brought another violation, grass length out of compliance. His yard was freshly mowed. Then came a third, unapproved vegetation near the rear of the home. The rosemary bush he'd tended for a year. It became clear, this wasn't about rules. This was pressure, steady, targeted, and increasing. Keith kept documenting. Every notice. Every inspection. Every slow roll of Delilah's car past his home. But the strangest thing wasn't the harassment. It was the vibrations. They grew stronger. More rhythmic. Almost mechanical. Sometimes he'd stand in the basement, motionless, listening to the faint thud-thud-thud under the concrete like something alive was working beneath his feet. Then one night, a paint can rolled across the floor, not from vibration this time, but from movement in the air. A soft draft flowed from behind the utility panel, where no draft should exist. The next afternoon, he heard it, a scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from behind the same wall. Keith's stomach tightened. Something, or someone, was under his house. Still, he tried to stay logical. He checked for plumbing issues. He inspected the soil line outside. He searched for animal burrows. He found nothing. But the HOA pressure kept building. Another notice arrived, accusing him of unsafe storage because a rake leaned against his backyard shed. Then a threat of a safety violation for exposed materials, the lumber he'd been using for a backyard bench. Keith wasn't paranoid anymore. He was targeted. Neighbors started to notice. Some sympathized in quiet conversations by their mailboxes, glancing around before speaking. Others avoided eye contact entirely, afraid of appearing against the HOA. But a few came forward, sharing their own stories, petty fines, surprise inspections, secret complaints. A pattern emerged. Selective enforcement. Selective harassment. Selective targets. And Keith fit the pattern perfectly. Then came the first drone. It hovered above his backyard on a bright Saturday afternoon, drifting slowly over his property line before settling over the pecan tree. Silver. Nearly silent. Keith didn't move. He simply stared. The drone stared back. 10 minutes later, an HOA email arrived. Unregistered exterior lighting fixture observed from above. The string lights he'd removed months ago were still neatly coiled on his workbench, inside the house. That was the moment he realized Delilah wasn't just enforcing rules. She was watching him. The next week, the vibrations turned violent. A toolbox toppled over. A jar shattered. The basement floor trembled long enough for Keith to feel it in his knees. He pressed his palm to the concrete. There, the faint hum of machinery. Something was moving beneath him. He installed a small motion-activated camera in the basement. The following morning, he found footage that chilled him. A shadow, long, distorted, moving across the far end of the basement near the crawlspace. Not inside the room. Under it. That same night, he heard a noise at the basement window, soft metal against glass, then the quick sound of footsteps fleeing into the darkness. Keith realized he couldn't ignore it anymore. He contacted an old friend, a structural engineer, and asked him to take a look. They walked the property, examined the interior walls, tapped along the basement floor. When his friend reached the utility panel, he stopped. He pressed a hand to the wall. Then he looked at Keith, eyes narrowed. "Something's off here," he said quietly. "Something beneath you is moving. And it's not an animal." He recommended a deeper inspection, something Keith didn't want to admit he already feared. That evening, determined to find the source, Keith unscrewed the utility panel. Behind it was insulation, wiring, and a small wooden board. The board had been recently removed and reattached. He could see the fresh scratches on the nails. He pulled it off. Behind it was a hole. A small, rough opening carved directly into the earth beneath his house. The soil was freshly disturbed. Support beams held back the dirt. Electrical cables snaked deeper into darkness. The deeper he looked, the more the truth sharpened. This wasn't a sinkhole. This wasn't soil settling. This wasn't an accident. This was excavation. A tunnel. A tunnel moving toward HOA-owned land. Keith stepped back, adrenaline tightening his chest. He wasn't imagining things. He wasn't overreacting. Someone was digging below his foundation. Intentionally, methodically, aggressively. He photographed everything. Sent photos to his engineer friend. Saved videos. Documented soil displacement. And as if sensing that he had finally discovered the truth, Delilah escalated. She mailed a formal violation accusing him of unauthorized excavation. She issued a warning that Keith's property might be structurally compromised. She filed a complaint claiming Keith was endangering community safety with destabilizing home modifications. Then she called the police. 2 officers knocked on his door, responding to a dangerous home construction report filed by Delilah. Keith led them to the basement, explaining what he'd found. The officers were skeptical but took notes. One of them muttered, "This doesn't look like homeowner work." Delilah, watching from the street, pretended to cry. Neighbors later said she dramatically claimed Keith was destroying the neighborhood and putting families at risk. But Keith wasn't alone anymore. More neighbors began speaking up. Some revealed Delilah had hinted that his land might be better repurposed. Others admitted she had mentioned an HOA expansion proposal. One even disclosed that Delilah had said Keith's property was not a good long-term fit for the community. Piece by piece, the truth unfurled. The HOA wanted more land. Delilah wanted authority. Keith's home was in the way. And the tunnel beneath his house was no accident. It was part of a plan, a quiet, covert sabotage designed to condemn his property and seize the land for the HOA's new facilities. Keith gathered his evidence and contacted the state attorney general's office. They agreed to evaluate the documentation. It wasn't a formal investigation yet, but it was a start. And that's when everything exploded. One stormy night, with thunder rolling and rain pounding the windows, the vibrations returned, stronger than ever. The floor shook violently, throwing tools across the basement. Keith grabbed his camera and ran downstairs. He didn't even make it halfway. A deafening crack erupted beneath the floor. The ground buckled. Concrete split open. A massive section of the basement collapsed downward, revealing the full extent of the tunnel carved beneath his home. Earth spilled into the room. Support beams snapped. The void yawned beneath him, wide, deep, horrifying. And in the beam of his flashlight, Keith saw the unthinkable. A generator, cables, fresh tool marks, and evidence of human activity, unmistakable, deliberate. The HOA hadn't just dug a tunnel. They had dug a chamber. And now his entire house was beginning to sink into it. The rising action ends here, with the floor crumbling, the tunnel exposed, and Keith standing at the edge of the nightmare Delilah built beneath his home. The only question left is, what happens when the ground finally gives way? The collapse brought everything and everyone to his doorstep at once. Sirens tore through the neighborhood, red and blue lights flashing across the broken edges of Keith's basement floor. Within minutes, squad cars lined the street, fire trucks blocked intersections, and emergency cones marked the soft, unstable earth swallowing the corner of his home. Neighbors poured out onto their lawns, recording the chaos with shaking hands. Some whispered in horror. Others watched with thin-lipped resignation, as if they had expected this day to come. City engineers arrived next, rushing into the basement with helmets and lamps, staring into the exposed tunnel like they were looking into the mouth of something unnatural and dangerous. They spoke quickly, urgently, pointing at the support beams, the earth displacement, the generator cables still humming faintly at the bottom of the pit. Their faces tightened with dread. They knew exactly what they were seeing. Illegal excavation. Intentional destabilization. A structural time bomb planted directly beneath a family's home. But the moment that turned the chaos into confrontation was the arrival of Delilah Gray. She appeared at the edge of the police tape wearing a perfectly pressed blazer and a trembling mask of faux shock, clutching a stack of HOA forms like sacred artifacts. She pushed through the crowd with exaggerated urgency, waving her arms and crying loudly enough for the entire block to hear. She yelled that Keith's home was dangerous, that she had warned him, that this collapse was proof of his negligence. Her voice rose above the sirens, desperate and dramatic, pointing at the crumbling hole as if it vindicated months of harassment. But no one moved toward her. Not the police. Not the engineers. Not the neighbors. Because Keith was already standing with the officials, covered in concrete dust, holding the one thing that separated truth from lies, evidence. He presented the entire timeline, every photo of fresh soil, every video of vibrations, every record of unauthorized inspections, and the footage from the basement camera showing shadows moving under the crawlspace. He showed the engineer's written warning. He showed timestamps proving the vibrations aligned with HO activity hours. And finally, he showed the images taken just hours earlier, staring directly into the tunnel with its beams and carved-out chamber leading straight toward HOA-owned land. The police didn't take their eyes off the evidence. The city inspectors didn't either. Keith then handed over soil samples showing recent disturbance, fresh cut marks on the supporting boards, and the measurements proving the tunnel was intentionally angled beneath his property line before curving toward the HOA's planned community center expansion zone. The realization hit the officials like a shockwave. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't land settling. This wasn't homeowner negligence. This was engineered sabotage. As the truth sank in, neighbors began murmuring, louder now, more confident. Some stepped closer to the police to confirm rumors they'd heard, offhand comments Delilah had made about getting his land one way or another, about removing the problem quietly, about unsafe foundations she insisted existed before the collapse. Others admitted that she had recently asked the board to consider emergency condemnation powers, framing it as a necessary step for community improvement. The facade crumbled around her. And then came the final blow, the one thing Delilah didn't know Keith had. A whistleblowing board member had slipped him internal emails the night before. In those emails, Delilah had outlined the entire scheme, the staged violations. The tunnel described as a quiet workaround. The plan to declare his home unsafe. The proposal to seize his land under emergency infrastructure needs. The emails were detailed, time-stamped, explicit. When Keith handed them to police, the shift was instantaneous. The officers walked straight to Delilah. Their expressions hardened. Her dramatic tears melted into confusion, then panic, then unrestrained fury as cameras from half the neighborhood recorded her unraveling. She tried pointing at Keith, claiming he orchestrated everything. She blamed the soil, blamed the house, blamed outsiders ruining community standards. But the officers didn't move. Not until the senior inspector stepped forward, holding the photos of the tunnel, and shook his head. That was the moment her world collapsed as violently as the ground beneath Keith's home. The police reached for her arms. Delilah screamed, not in fear, but in outrage, in disbelief that her authority no longer protected her. She kicked at the dirt, shouting that the HOA had the right, that she was improving the neighborhood, that she had legal grounds for everything she did. The officers held firm, guiding her toward the cruiser as neighbors stared in silence. Behind her, other board members were separated and questioned. Phone screens lit up as whistleblowers came forward, stepping out of the shadows now that the queen of their quiet tyranny had fallen. Years of complaints, hidden threats, and manipulated votes spilled into the open. The HOA wasn't just cracking. It was collapsing. City officials declared the tunnel illegal. Police opened an investigation into property sabotage. Engineers documented the structural risk to surrounding homes. And at the center of it all stood Keith, exhausted, shaking, covered in dust, but finally believed. As Delilah was pushed into the back of the police cruiser, she screamed one last time, a shrill, desperate sound swallowed by the flashing lights and rising voices of the neighborhood. But this time, no one looked at her. All eyes were on the tunnel, on the evidence, on the truth that had been buried, until the ground itself exposed it. The officers closed the cruiser door. The neighborhood fell silent. And in that silence, one truth settled heavily in the air. What collapsed today wasn't just a foundation, it was the entire system Delilah built on power, prejudice, and greed. And the aftermath was only just beginning. The moment Delilah's cruiser pulled away, the street fell into an uneasy calm. Police lights faded into the dark, leaving only the quiet murmur of neighbors processing what they had just witnessed. The tunnel still yawned beneath Keith's home like a wound, but the truth was finally exposed, raw and undeniable. For the first time in months, Keith didn't feel like he was defending himself against whispers or manufactured violations. The burden had shifted. The weight was no longer on him. It was on the HOA. And in the hours that followed, that weight crushed everything Delilah had built. Before dawn, the remaining board members resigned. Not with dignity, not with remorse, but with hurried emails sent to the police when they realized they were next in line for questioning. By sunrise, the state had already initiated a full receivership process, suspending the HOA's authority and locking access to its accounts. Delilah's home was searched. Her office files seized. Her HOA-issued laptop confiscated. The empire she'd ruled through intimidation collapsed faster than the soil she had destabilized. Authorities announced the list of charges by the end of the week. Property destruction, illegal excavation, misuse of community funds, endangerment, discrimination. The public statement alone felt like a form of justice, a plain, factual confirmation of everything neighbors had whispered about in fear. News crews flocked to the neighborhood, broadcasting the story statewide. People from nearby communities drove past slowly, shaking their heads at the yellow tape wrapped around the property line. But for Keith, the real impact wasn't the headlines. It was the quiet moments that followed. Engineers stabilized the structure over the next several days, filling the tunnel with reinforced concrete and installing new foundational supports, all paid for by an emergency fund frozen from the HOA's accounts. As state investigators dug deeper into Delilah's finances, they discovered she had authorized tens of thousands of dollars in infrastructure expenses that were actually used to hire unlicensed workers to dig the tunnel. Those funds were redirected to Keith as part of the settlement the county expedited on his behalf. When the dust finally settled and Keith stepped back into his home, he felt the silence differently. Not threatening. Not monitored. Just quiet. The first thing he did was retrieve Delilah's old surveillance drone from the oak tree where it had crashed weeks earlier. He held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of everything it symbolized: intrusion, control, power abused under the guise of community standards. Then he crushed it with one clean press of his boot. The crack of shattered plastic echoed across the yard like the final snap of a long, stretched-out rope. The neighborhood changed quickly after that. The fear evaporated almost overnight. People who once refused to make eye contact during HOA patrol hours now walked across the street to talk. They brought casseroles, checked in on Keith daily, and shared stories they had been too afraid to speak before. Stories of Delilah's threats. Her favoritism. Her carefully engineered finds that always seemed to target the same families. The ones she felt didn't fit her vision. When the state finally dissolved the HOA entirely, the community didn't celebrate with speeches or dramatic gestures. They celebrated with something simpler, something more powerful: unity. Block parties replaced board meetings. Neighbors helped repair each other's porches, repaint fences, replant gardens that had been ripped up under bogus citations. For the first time, the community felt like it belonged to the people who lived there, not the people who tried to control it. A new, voluntary neighborhood council formed months later. Not an HOA, not an authority, but a cooperative group focused on safety, fairness, and shared responsibility. Keith was asked to join, but he politely declined. He didn't want power. He had seen what power, unchecked, could turn into. Instead, he volunteered to lead a structural safety committee, teaching neighbors how to understand their home reports, how to spot foundational risks, how to read permits. Knowledge, he realized, was the greatest defense anyone could have against abuse. Meanwhile, Delilah's fall from grace was as dramatic as her rise had been meticulous. Her mugshot circulated online. Her trial became a local sensation. Former allies distanced themselves with lightning speed. State prosecutors uncovered years of manipulated votes, misappropriated funds, and targeted discrimination documented across archived emails and meeting minutes. She tried to shift the blame onto the board, the contractors, even the homeowners themselves, but the evidence was overwhelming. The tunnel, the emails, the financial records, the threatened condemnations, all pointed in one direction. She was convicted on multiple counts, sentenced to a mix of prison time and financial restitution that would follow her long after her release. The woman who once smirked from behind HOA letterheads now sat in a prison jumpsuit, powerless, unrecognized, forgotten by the empire she created. And yet, Keith didn't celebrate her downfall. Not in the way some expected. He didn't rejoice. He didn't gloat. He simply moved forward. Because rebuilding wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something Delilah had tried to take. His stability, his dignity, his peace. As months passed, Keith's home became a symbol of resilience. Kids played in yards once patrolled by Delilah's compliance walks. Neighbors planted wildflowers without fear of violation notices. Holiday decorations stayed up as long as people wanted them to. There were no more surprise inspections, no more petty warnings, no more quietly delivered threats. Just life. Normal, peaceful life. And through it all, Keith found himself standing taller. Not because he won, but because he endured. Because he refused to let someone else control his future. Because the tunnel under his home, meant to break him, ended up revealing something far deeper. The strength of a community awakened. The truth no longer buried. The power of standing firm when someone tries to take what isn't theirs. In the end, the tunnel was sealed. But the lesson remained. People across the state saw the news stories. Legislators noticed, too. Within a year, a new HOA transparency law was passed, requiring open financial accounts, independent safety inspections, and strict limits on HOA authority. Keith's case was cited in the committee hearing, proof of what could happen when power goes unchecked. His story didn't just protect him. It protected thousands of homeowners he'd never meet. And as he stood on his rebuilt porch months later, watching neighbors gather for a summer cookout, laughter filling the air where fear once lived, he realized something profound. Homes can be rebuilt. Foundations can be repaired. But a community that chooses to stand together? That's unbreakable. So here's the question I'll leave you with. The same question Keith found himself asking when everything came crashing down. What would you do if you discovered a tunnel under your home, and it was dug by the very people supposed to protect your community? Let me know in the comments. And if you think the story is wild, just wait until you hear the next one.